Good morning, everyone. I'm Janet Irwin, Head of Education at the Ulrich Museum. And thank you to everyone for joining us this morning for our second program in a series of 10 paired faculty talks taking place during the 23rd Faculty Biennial. It's all part of the process. On view in our galleries through May 8th. Our galleries are open to the public Monday through Saturday, 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. Now in its 46th year, the biennial showcases the breadth of creative work and research being undertaken by the faculty of the School of Art and Design and Creative Industries in art history, art education, ceramics, curatorial practice, drawing, graphic design, painting, photography, printmaking, sculpture, and new media. This series of talks on the biennial's theme, It's All Part of the Process, seeks to prompt reflections and start conversations about each faculty member's personal process, highlighting the diversity of activities that contribute to creative practice, from research to studio time, to interactions with colleagues and students and beyond. I hope you will join us for the next Faculty Talk program on Wednesday, February 24th at 11 a.m. with Marco Hernandez, Assistant Professor of Print Media, and Levente Solyak, Associate Director and Associate Professor of Painting and Applied Drawing. This morning, we welcome John Hammer and Irma Puškarević. Let me see. John came to WSU from the private sector as an educational program manager and content developer within the tech industry. His passion for innovation helped build and maintain learning methodologies and delivery systems for effective and sustainable online learning in the technology, entertainment, and design sectors for a global market. His dedication as an educator has been recognized by peers in industry, including the award of Student Choice Faculty of the Year by the graduating seniors in 2012. John is currently working on his doctorate in educational leadership with a focus on adaptive learning systems for a diverse learner population. John received his MFA from Wichita State in 2007, where his focus was on traditional studio painting and new media. Besides working in the Office of Instructional Resources, John is also an adjunct faculty for the School of Fine Arts. He continues to create art in his studio and at his desk. Our second presenter this morning, Irma received her PhD in graphic design from the University of Novi Sad, Serbia. She is co-author of a textbook, Typefaces and Typography. Her research focuses on expressive qualities of typography and visual communication. Her writings on the rhetoric of typography and effectiveness of typography in various communication contexts appear in journals, conference proceedings, and as book chapters. Her work has also been exhibited in solo and group exhibitions. Her most recent research inquires into the global context of the typographic image. She is currently an assistant professor of graphic design at Wichita State University. Welcome, John.
Thank you. Is this where we begin?
This is where.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining, and I hope I keep this on track and legible or easily accessible. So the piece that I created is called Spiders in My Head, and it is a digital projection coming from a unit that I built that has the fairly close size that I occupy in space. It's my height and it's about as wide as I am. And then from there is a projection that is on the wall. The final piece is quite a bit different. Well, not quite a bit different, but it is somewhat different from what I had originally intended. But this is not unusual for me, that things change in the process. And I'm gonna kind of explain some of that, the reasoning, and then the process itself in this talk. So to give you a little bit of insight into me on a very high level, these are some random numbers of my life that equal 100. And that wasn't my intent when I started putting these numbers down. I just realized at one point that I think these actually equal 100. And so I thought that was a great place to stop, and I stopped there. Now, I may be fudging a little bit on the numbers with the number of times I changed my MFA focus. And since I received my MFA at Wichita State, I'm sure there's a couple of faculty members that were on my thesis board that would say, no, it was probably much more than 5. But that is typical of my life, was this changing focus or lack of focus, or being attracted by rather shiny objects or things, or in my case, often ideas. So in case you haven't seen the piece, I've got some parts of it here that we can see. The main focus or idea of the work is this little looped video itself. And it is on a perpetual loop, and it will continue to be on a perpetual loop until somebody walks by the unit, the projection unit, which then activates a trigger video. And the trigger video is the static. So I'm going to go ahead and pause this here. The static video is quite long, and it will stay in static mode until the environment actually comes to a standstill, or until there are no bodies moving around the unit. So any sort of activity will trigger this video into this perpetual loop, starting at the beginning. And we won't get back to the focus video, which is the exchange of bodily fluids, if you would, until it's just, there can't be any sort of movement. And I've got those two right here. So this video here is the target that I want to get to. However, in order to get to that target, the environment has to become exceptionally quiet and still. So the viewer, more than likely, will probably never quite get to this stage itself because of the disruptive interference of the static, unless they stand perfectly still and wait the approximate 5.5 minutes to get back to, slowly get back to this stage. And that process will happen as time passes. It looks like I actually have about 4 minutes and 15 seconds before it gets back to here. But this could go on indefinitely if the space around the unit is not quiet. So every bit of this piece is appropriated material, and it's appropriated through things that I search and find on the web. And then I work with the appropriated material to create the new thing that is, I guess, a mismatch of all of these components that I find in my brain anyways, that are related to the core idea. And it is a bit of song and dance, but the core idea, besides being the components being appropriated, there are also some flaws in that process. So this is something that I typed up, and I'll be getting into how this idea came to me for this piece. But as I typed this up, and it's a repetition. I realized after I was in the video editing program that the little nursery rhyme or song that I had typed out, I had mistakenly put fire instead of water. So, you know, the itsy bitsy spider went up the fire spout. And it's, of course, I think it's up the water spout, and it may even be down the water spout. But I was going from memory, and I'm not sure why I put fire in there, but I didn't realize it until I was actually doing the editing. And at that point, I kept it because I felt that it reflected that process that I go through with pretty much any sort of type of work or artwork that I do. So going into a little bit of a backstory, this piece and a lot of my work is based upon observation. And I spend a lot of downtime, just simply observing my environment and people around me. But I'm also the product of a lot of change. So if you remember those numbers from the beginning, we moved a lot when I was a kid. And then I carried that process or that habit into my adult life as well. Now I don't do that anymore, but there was a lot of residences, there was a lot of moving, there was a lot of changing of vehicles, there was change of careers, and many things that sort of kept my thinking process and my environment always in a perpetual state of change. So going into this sort of little backstory that I'm giving you could be sort of summed up in noise. There is the white noise that I experience in the classroom or in the environment. And it was always hard for me to stay focused because the voice of instructors or teachers was always a very soothing and relaxing type of noise for me. And then there was also the head noise. And this is a lot harder to organize and keep in line or keep in order. So perpetually, or what I found myself more attentive to was the window. And fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you view it, all of my classrooms growing up had a window, and that's where most of my attention would be. And a lot of that was observing. And it was a quiet space, this little window out into the world. My normal is very chaotic. And within that chaos, I typically then tend to find something that I can pull my focus to. And in that focus, time really does kind of slow down for me, and it does become quiet. And I'm fairly able to do that, even if the environment is quite chaotic. But it's much easier for me to do if I have some sort of control over my environment. So the way this piece was actually developed, and it has a story to it, was that I was in my Jeep, and I noticed that there were spider webs on my dash. And on that spider web was a spider that had decided to make a home inside my Jeep. And this was at the very beginning of us staying home due to the pandemic and working from home. And then also within that web, there was a dead fly. And I was quite fascinated by this because it seemed to be a small little story within my Jeep, this isolated little enclosure, small world. This spider and this fly were both living their life and dying within this little confine. And the way my brain works, I started making connections to other things that may be related or unrelated. And I started to develop this narrative that was based upon this observation, but really about larger ideas. And the idea for me was this sense of isolation And of course, the fear that came about through the pandemic. And of course, all of this ultimately kind of, I would say, boils down to the idea of death. So while I was then, and I had decided that I was going to make a piece based upon a couple of things. One, the fear that comes with isolation, but also the process that I experience when I am attempting to work on pretty much anything that and so I guess a subset or a core concept or intent was that that I try to express as best as possible the process of the way my mind works. So during the research process and grabbing materials, I happened to come across something that is called, and it's a site, and it's generated through AI, but what it does is, well, the site is called This Person Does Not Exist. And if you're not familiar with it, I'd encourage you to go and explore it. But it's AI that generates a human face that doesn't really exist. It's a collaborate, or it's a mishmash, a mashup of various photo images pulled from the web that are then mixed together to create this new face. And I almost went down a completely different direction with this art piece, and because as I was looking at these generated faces, I noticed that some of them had these odd things happening in the background. And this was my guess based upon the AI not knowing what to do if there was a secondary person in the picture when it was creating these faces that really don't exist. I'm sure somebody looks a lot like some of these people. So I really went down a rabbit hole, and I spent a lot of time developing this sort of secondary thought to the original thought. And then, of course, I realized that I was once again going rogue with my original idea, and I had to then go back and start editing it out. But to give you an idea, this is a video clip of all of the files that were created, appropriated, and mashed up to create the piece that that is on display. Now, not all of this was used, but at one point, nearly all of this was in the piece that I then had to strip away to get back to that core idea. And Janet, if I run over my allotted time, please let me know, because that might be easily possible for me. So the work itself, besides the content within the work, really is an attempted illustration at the I guess behind the scenes process of how I think and how I then produce. So this is a still of the static video. And I was actually quite pleased with what I did. Now, this image that you're seeing is comprised of a lot of different parts that I then manipulate. So this that you're seeing was not appropriated. This is something that is the product of me using the appropriated material to generate this moving image. And without getting too obvious with my explanation, it really was about trying to illustrate the elusive connectedness that sometimes takes place when I am wanting to to crystallize perhaps an idea or a concept. I really enjoy the way the text will disappear into these little fragmented bits of information. And here's another example. And then just the work itself, showing you how it works. And that is it. Did I say my allotted time? Maybe I ran a little bit fast. So, Jana, what do I do from here?
Thank you, John. Irma, are you ready to roll?
Yes, I am. Hello, everyone. I am very pleased to be joining you here today. I am one of the new faculty at the School of Arts, Design and Creative Industries, and this is the first time that I'm contributing to the biennial show. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to showcase my work at the Ulrich Museum next to a brilliant work of my colleagues. And I'll jump right into my presentation. This will stop, okay. Right. Okay. Well, this time around, Ulrich Museum has set a challenge or a theme, if you like, for the faculty. It's all part of the process, and the designer in me took this theme as a guiding light and started to produce work that is in a way related to that activity that we call process. But before I start talking about my work, I wanted to briefly show you some excerpts from the work that I did before, in a way just to give a context to the work that I do now. The image that you see here is the image that I took when I was undergrad. It depicts a snowboarder hitting a jump. More precisely, we see the moment when the snowboarder is flying over the jump once he jump started off the edge. And what the image doesn't reveal is what is actually in the background. The trees, hills, people cheering, other snowboarders line up waiting for their turn, the jump itself, its length and height, details that are expected from a shot of such scene. But standing there and observing this environment, I decided that this shot would be in a way static and plain, and it would be stripped away from the energy and movement that this sport is associated with. So seeing the next snowboarder in line, I ran to the jump and I positioned myself at the edge of it on the ground, and I was just waiting for the moment when the snowboarder will fly over my head. So going off-road, as designer Eddie Opara says, was instinctive reaction for me. Of course, that instinct was shaped by works of Cartier-Bresson, James Nachtwey, Nan Goldin, and many photographers I looked up at the time. And when I took this image, it was a milestone for me because I understood what approach my work will take from then on. And this interest in extreme sports culture and street culture that is a reflection of freestyle and free form, free spirit, led me to a project where I collaborated with a local community in this respect, and we started a magazine for extreme sports culture. And on this project, I worked with locals, but also with people from the region, and I helped build a visual identity of this magazine. And the relevance of this project for my career lies in the fact that this was a source for my master's thesis, deconstruction in magazine design, or deconstruction in magazine layout. During the work on my master thesis, I got to explore a lot about European avant-garde movements, but also experimental Japanese arts direction. And my focus was on typography and publications. In that respect, I cannot not mention Filippo Marinetti and his sound poem, Zang Tum Tum. His work can be considered as a typographic turn because it challenged the language and the aesthetics, like the visual manifestation of language. And he liberated the language from the page and consequently liberated typography of the page. He challenged traditional typesetting techniques and legibility. And his work went on to inspire a lot of generations in the 20th century. Another important influence in my work that I want to mention is a magazine, Emigre, founded by Rudy van der Lans and Susanna Lico in California. Officially, it is described as an alternative culture graphic design magazine, but in truth, it was a vibrant playground for Rudy and Susanna to challenge the established graphic design rules of modernism, experiment with typography, and most importantly, experiment with the new technology that was emerging at the time, and which a lot of designers at the time actually feared, the computer. And layering, bitmap typography, and disruption of the conventional form became then associated with this magazine. And the most recent knowledge base that I've been investigating comes from the field of typeface design. Due to globalization, we are using multiple writing systems or scripts, and they have entered the world of graphic design on this global level. And that integration of multiple scripts most definitely enriches the visual vocabulary. However, it still battles to avoid cultural prestige and establish meaningful relationships between cultures. And going off of this new context and this topic of cohabitation of multiple scripts, I considered embedding that in the work that is now on display in the museum and the work that I'm going to talk to you about the next few slides. So going off of the theme of this year's show, it's all about the process. I immediately went to the source of my thoughts, and that was my sketchbook. This artifact is a place where I map my thoughts, language, words, meaning. They're all very important elements of my work, whether I'm writing a paper, working on developing a visual narrative for a client, or just working on a personal project. I always start with reading and information acquisition, and I use a sketchbook to record my thoughts. My thoughts can't stand still, that's their nature, and I don't record them in one go. So most definitely this is a conversation that I have with myself. And I use these thought archives as a starting point for developing an idea for the work that is now displayed in the biennial. And I use it in such a way that I observed more the visual manifestation of the thoughts and not so much the content itself. And researching on multiscript typography, I reflected on my own connection to biscriptal way of graphic communication. I come from the region where the duality of alphabets is present and has historical roots. And this is quite rare because most of the countries that use dual alphabets, they, let's say, borrow a Latin alphabet in a way to enter the global scene. And what you're seeing here on the slide is a biscript typeface system. It is called Balkan, and consisting of Latin and Cyrillic scripts. It's based on a phenomenon known as the Balkan Sprachbund, the linguistic features shared between different languages because of their geographical proximity and language contact. And looking at the visual manifestation of my thoughts, I was again drawn to the works of the artists of the avant-garde movement, and I revisited the avant-garde movement of Yugoslavia. And these are some of the publications that are still held in high regard due to the impact they had on visual culture and the visual poetics of the Balkan region and beyond. So this publication, Zenit, was founded by Ljubomir Mitic in the 1920s. And it is the single most important publication that guided generations of artists and creative minds that helped visual culture of the Balkan region. And we still feel those impacts today. And from the very beginning, the magazine established itself as an international magazine. And this internationalism is reflected in its visual identity as well. And you can see here in the masthead, the symbiosis of Cyrillic and Latin. So for example, this first character that you now perceive probably as number 3 is actually a Cyrillic character for Z. And then E, N, I, and T are from a Latin alphabet. On another issue, on the cover page, even though masthead is in Latin, there is again cohabitation of Latin and Cyrillic, where a city of Belgrade is typed in Latin alphabet and city of Zagreb in Cyrillic. Once I started analyzing the form itself, the historical, cultural, and social influences that I learned about through my research helped me understand the forms better. But most importantly, the research helps me understand my own relationship to the reference and the way I want to incorporate it into my work. So what you're now looking is some of the references that I use for the current work. On the left-hand side is some works of Zaharie Stefanović Orfelin, who was what we would call a polymath. He was a lot of things, among others, a calligrapher and influenced generations of calligraphers. And he lived and worked in the 18th century. And on the right-hand side is one of the most significant, what we call it like cultural monuments, one of the most important manuscripts that was written in Cyrillic. And this was one of the first manuscripts written in Cyrillic that dates back to 11th century. And it's connected to this path of Serbo-Slavic literacy and progression in that respect. Coming back to my, moving back to my studio. Here you can see my studio. Well, actually you can't see much. I have never had a place where I work, well, like one designated place where I work. Sitting down and working on a project usually means a behavior similar to my thought mapping. Sometimes I'll work in my office, sometimes I'll work at my home, sometimes in a coffee place or in nature. It can happen that I'd work when I'm on the bus, train, or plane. I have written down ideas on receipts, on margins in magazine, and anything that is close at the time. And I feel I'm gonna forget the thought, or if I just want to sketch something and archive it for later. So this is the current work, and this is the work when it comes together. However, it is not displayed in this form in the museum. The work itself is layered due to various references that it holds. It is deconstructed or defragmented, and I'll go over each piece separately. So these fragments address visual manifestation of the thought mapping that I do, and that was a starting, and that is usually a starting point of my process. Language is the essential part of the process, and there is a meaning also in the visual representation of the language. And here you can see that duality of polished and unpolished letter form, coexistence of mature and not so mature thought. You can see coexistence of languages. You can see coexistence of scripts, letter forms coming from two different alphabets. We can read this as layering on one's identity, process of identifying oneself. Each of these fragments depicts somewhat ambiguous word construction, reflecting mapping and disconnection before a meaningful link is made and a cohesive thought or idea is formed. And I will read now what is depicted in each piece, and I will read it as it comes natural to me, and you can read the translation on the slide. Pro, integracija, vizualni oblici smisla nemaju. Ces, kohabitacija, zaustaviti je cilj. Pro, form transfer look always grotesque. Ces, critical time, connected no culture. And here is the view of the work as it is displayed in the museum. I wanted the viewer to experience the notions of mapping, connection, displacing, coexistence. Technique I used is a combination of several techniques, analog drawing, digital drawing, scanning parts of my sketchbook and deconstructing the language, taking apart words and bringing them together to form new constructs of thoughts using digital tools. The final work is printed on vinyl and placed on the floor. After several months, this work will be touched by many, hopefully, possibly modified as people walk over it. I wanted this to be a temporal work. Once it is removed from the floor, it can't take its original form, signaling a time for new ideas and conversations. Thank you.
Thanks, Irma. John, you want to join us? I thought I would, for the Q&A, I will go ahead and give everyone the ability to turn on their cameras and their mics, and you can ask your questions directly to John and Irma. It might take me a few minutes to do this, so as everyone starts to come in, go ahead and ask your questions. Emily.
Hi, Shannon. Hi, Irma and John. I have a question for Irma, which is really, I'm just asking for advice.
Okay.
Which is, because I also write notes on the back of envelopes and various places. So how do you not lose all those things? I'm asking for a friend.
You're asking for a friend. Well, you can tell your friend that there's always a designated place for those things. So you can see here, I stack everything and I literally take it with me everywhere I go within the house. But then when I leave the house, it has a place where I keep it. If I need to take it with me in a backpack, I have like a folder. So they're all neatly tucked together, so I don't lose them because they are very precious. But it's a system that I developed over time.
And do you have a different folder for each project?
Actually, after the project is done, then I sort it out, because when I'm working on a project, the papers, envelopes, receipts are all over the place. But because I want to archive them for the future reference, then when it's done, it goes into a separate folder. But when I do it, I have it all together, because sometimes projects will overlap. So these are some notes for this talk, but also I was supposed to write a letter of recommendation. It's just a mix of things. But thank you for the question. I mean, shared knowledge.
We have a.
Oh, sorry. Go
Hi,
ahead.
Joshua. Go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, I was just going to ask a quick question. Wonderful presentations, by the way. This is really fun to explore the work. I was just curious, Irma, what you thought about where the direction of kind of multilingual work is headed in kind of the design space. I mean, I could really easily see this expanding. I was just curious kind of where you think that's heading in maybe the short term and maybe in the long term.
Well, as I said, I started discovering this concept within the typeface design because that's where it has been recognized as a major problem, because a lot of typefaces are Latin-based and then they just appropriate the other cultures' typeface. But now they're bringing in different cultures and working together on it. And I think it will reflect the global scene. So if all of a sudden, on a global scale, graphic design becomes again monoculture, it will go back to that space. Hopefully not. I just see it expanding and expanding, and just in this world where cultures coexist and we incorporate different ways of communicating based off of different cultural sensibilities and things like that. I hope that answered your question. Not quite sure. Yeah, okay, thank you for the question.
I had a question, Irma. What do you think about emojis and sort of the resurgence of a pictographic language? Do you have any thoughts about that or interest in your own work related to that?
I haven't had interest in it yet, because most of my work is that I research revolves around typography, and that's where I put all of my efforts in. Even though graphic design does include emojis, graphic communication does include other visual tools like illustration, photography, collage, icons. I think they're necessary for our everyday communication, and they also can serve as a means of starting conversation in an artistic sense. But due to the technology that we use, I mean, we cannot really escape them. So maybe to answer your questions from this very personal perspective is I see them as the way as I see text. I just communicate with them. I have no definite opinion about them yet.
Okay, thank you.
Do any of our non-video participants have a question they'd like to ask? If you don't want to turn on your video, you don't have to. You can just turn on your mic and talk to us.
Hey, I also had a question for Irma. I'm curious on your thought mapping process. I wondered if that's something you've always kind of had that same format, or is that something you picked up along your studies in those like European avant-garde movements that you mentioned?
Carter, that is an excellent question. And I'm very grateful that you have asked it because I was reflecting on this myself when I was doing this project. And it actually dates back to high school. I went to a language high school. I believe you would call it a grammar school. In any case, language was the priority of the educational system or the program within that school. So I would write down what teachers would say in the class, because they would say that they will not give you an A if you only read the books. I mean, you would have to understand the story that they would also say, because they would say something that is not in the book. And I was so scared that I was going to miss something that I started writing in these notebooks, and everybody used them later on. And I think I developed the habit of just quick writing and then mapping the thoughts from that time. But the format has changed. So the ones that you're seeing now in the presentation and some of the parts of the sketchbook are in the show, that has developed and evolved through time. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you, Carter.
Well, I have a question for both of you. This is Jeff Pulaski. Sorry, I don't have my camera on, but that's all right. You know what I look like. I'm curious if both of you have pieces that are interactive. John, yours is much more intentional that way in a way, but Irma, yours is just kind of incidental as people move around the space. I'm curious what you think about, or what's interesting about that interaction to you, and John, I'm kind of curious about yours in that there's something in it that really, if there's interaction, people will very rarely, if ever, see that portion of it, unless I suppose they stand at a distance and watch. But Irma, yours is kind of the destructive nature of people moving over it and what that might look like after a month or 2 months and what you could do with that if you've thought about that aspect.
John, you want to?
I'll let you go first.
Oh, well, for me, the interactivity was a reflection of the mapping of thoughts in a way. And also, you said distractive nature. I mean, it is going to disappear at some point, probably. People will walk over it. And it also should reflect in that respect, how our own thoughts and ideas go away, disappear, sometimes disconnect. And also when they are formed as a cohesive idea, they move to another place and start to exist in another place. And this one is gone. So I guess in a way I wanted to achieve that through interactivity. And I have no, I wouldn't mind if it gets destroyed in a week, because that would kind of reflect the overall thought or idea behind the piece. Thank you for the question.
Hi, Jeff. So my intention was that, what I imagined anyways, was that, and I haven't actually seen it working with viewers in the room. So I'd be kind of curious and keen to see what that actually looks like. But the idea, the intent was that two separate people could be talking about the piece, and one might have seen the core idea or the core video, which is the exchange of bodily fluids, and talk about that. And the second person would have no idea what they were talking about, and maybe perhaps talking about a different piece because they didn't have the opportunity or the patience to wait for that to actually manifest. And I was hoping that not to be mean, but part of the process would, or the experience for the viewer would be some frustration as well at the inability to get to that core idea or that core thought and maintain it.
Can you give me a toy?
I'm sorry? And that it might enable the viewer to experience at least a small fragment of my day-to-day, essentially.
Very good, thanks.
Irma, I did want to mention that there is a likelihood that there will remain a ghost image left over from the removed vinyl on the floor that will persist for years to come.
Oh, okay. I would really like that, unless you guys mind.
There is a good possibility that will be the case.
It will contribute to the overall idea in its own way.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah.
But I suspect that will be the case. Does anyone else have a question? Okay, well, I think we'll wrap it up. That gives Irma plenty of time to get to her class that she's teaching at 11. And I want to thank everybody for joining us this morning. And if questions occur to you after the program, you can always email either myself or John or Irma, and I'm sure they'd be happy to answer them when we're done. Thank you, Irma. Thank you, John. Hope to see everybody next week for the next in the series.
Thank you, Jenna. And
yeah. Thank you.
Nice,
Everybody have a great day. Stay warm.
Bye.
Bye.